He said it plainly. You were never mine. I set the mug down without spilling a drop, which told me more about myself than his words ever could. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, or watched someone you love suffer in silence, don't look away. This story begins with one accusation and ends somewhere no one expected. Somewhere inside my purse, thin paper rested like a held breath, and I kept it there. Not yet. The clock over the sink read 7:42 a.m., the same time he used to leave for work, back when leaving meant returning. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and lemon cleaner, and the radio murmured whether I wasn't listening to. I nodded once, calm enough to unsettle him, and asked if he wanted more coffee. He blinked, surprised by the lack of noise. 4 years he'd practiced this speech in pieces, letting it drip out in jokes, side comments, silences that felt heavier than words. Today he'd chosen the blade. He leaned against the counter, arms folded as if distance could keep him steady. I watched his knuckles pale. My heart was loud, but my voice wasn't. I said, "Say it again," not to challenge him but to anchor the moment. He repeated himself, softer this time, eyes skimming past me to the window where frost traced the glass. Outside, the street was quiet. Mrs. Hanley's paper lay folded at the curb. A delivery truck idled down the block. Ordinary things kept happening which felt wrong. I thought of my mother upstairs, moving slowly the way she does now, careful with her knees. I thought of all the times I'd flinched on her behalf. I didn't flinch today. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering, then dropped it. "I knew," he said, as if certainty could be retroactive. He talked about resemblance, about how people had noticed. He used the word truth, like a shield. I listened, cataloging the tells. The way he avoided dates, the way he skipped the hospital entirely. There was a loose thread in his story, and I tugged it quietly by asking where he'd been that night. He shrugged. He always shrugs when details matter. The kettle clicked off behind me, too loud in the small room. I poured water I didn't need, watching steam curl up like a warning. My hand didn't shake. That felt new. He asked why I was so calm, and I told him I'd had practice. I didn't mention the envelope. I didn't mention the name that kept surfacing when I organized old boxes last winter. A name written twice in different inks. He wouldn't understand patience. He confuses it with surrender. A memory pressed in. My mother at the kitchen table years ago, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, saying nothing while he spoke for both of them. I remembered the way silence can bruise. Today I chose a different kind. I asked him if he wanted to sit. He refused, pride stiff as a collar. I noticed the stain on his sleeve he hadn't seen. The small human messes that persist even when someone believes they're righteous. The radio shifted to a traffic report. Time kept tapping its foot. He said my calm proved guilt. I smiled just enough to make him pause. Or preparation, I said, and felt the word land between us. He watched my purse then, finally noticing it on the chair, as if intuition had been trying to warn him all morning. I slid it closer to my feet, slow and deliberate. I felt my age then, not as weakness but as weight earned. 65 years teaches you how rooms change when truth enters them. I noticed the draft near the door, the hum of the fridge, the way light flattened his features. I remembered keeping grocery lists on the back of envelopes, learning to save what mattered. Whatever came next would be saved too, carefully for daylight. I inhaled once, counting tiles on the floor, choosing restraint over relief, knowing timing decides whether truth heals or wounds later. When he finished, he waited for me to break. Instead, I asked him to repeat the first sentence again, exactly as he'd said it. He frowned, annoyed now. I stood, met his eyes, and reached for my purse, feeling the edge of the envelope through the fabric. "If you're certain," I said, steady as the clock, "we should talk face to face with everyone who needs to hear it." He laughed once, sharp. I didn't. The room went still, and he realized I wasn't flinching anymore. The room stayed still after his laugh, like it was holding its breath with me. I didn't pull the envelope out then. I felt it against my leg as I walked past him, the paper inside warm now, almost alive. I said I needed air, which was true, and stepped onto the back porch where the boards creaked the way they always had. The cold bit my ankles through thin socks. It felt deserved. Behind me he kept talking, explaining himself to no one, the words muffled by the door I didn't quite close. I sat on the porch chair and finally opened the envelope. The proof didn't feel like relief. It didn't loosen anything in my chest. It settled there instead, solid and heavy, like a tool placed carefully in my hand. Names. Numbers. Clear language that didn't argue or accuse. Just facts lined up patient. I read it twice, slower the second time, noticing how calm my breathing stayed. That scared me more than his accusation had. Inside, a drawer slammed. He was moving things around now, irritated by my quiet. I folded the papers and slid them back where they belonged. Not because I was afraid of him seeing them, but because I wasn't ready to be finished with this moment. Proof changes the shape of things. You have to know how to use it. My phone buzzed. A message from my daughter asking if I'd found the old birth records yet. I typed back a simple yes and then erased it. Too soon. I told her I'd call later. I wanted my voice to sound like mine when I did. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood brushing crumbs from the chair like a small, unnecessary ritual. In the kitchen, he'd gone quiet. He stood at the sink, staring into it as if answers might float up from the drain. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, feeling it travel down, grounding me. He asked if I'd called anyone. I said no. That was true. He asked what was in my purse. I said paperwork. Also true. Truth can be narrow like that. I went upstairs to check on my mother. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, cardigan buttoned wrong, reading glasses pushed too high on her nose. She looked at my face and knew not to ask yet. That's the kind of knowing women pass down quietly. I fixed her buttons, kissed her cheek, told her I'd make soup later. Her hand lingered on mine longer than usual. I felt the years of waiting in that touch. Back in my old room, I opened a box I'd avoided for decades. Report cards. A faded hospital bracelet. A folded program from a church service I barely remembered. At the bottom, an envelope with handwriting that wasn't my mother's. I'd noticed it once before and dismissed it. Today I didn't. Inside was a photocopy, grainy, incomplete, with a name circled in blue ink. A nurse. The ink had bled slightly, like someone had pressed too hard. Downstairs, he called my name, irritation sharpening into concern. I answered that I needed time. He said time was exactly what he'd wasted. I almost laughed. Instead, I sat on the bed and lined things up. Papers from my purse, the photocopy, a small notebook where I'd started writing questions months ago without knowing why. Patterns began to form. Not conclusions. Not yet. But direction. At noon, I drove to the records office across town. The building smelled like dust and old carpet. The clerk recognized me from last winter and smiled with the careful kindness reserved for older women with unfinished business. She told me some files were archived off-site. I said I could wait. I meant it. Waiting has never been my weakness. I watched the clock tick past 1, listened to the hum of the heater, and felt something inside me steady itself. When I returned home, he was gone. A note on the counter said he needed a drive. The house felt lighter without him in it, like furniture after a move. I made soup for my mother. We ate quietly. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was learning how to be. She nodded, satisfied with that. That evening, I laid everything out on the dining table, smoothing edges, stacking pages. Proof doesn't shout. It waits. I looked at the nurse's name again, the inconsistent handwriting, the missing signatures. Not answers yet. But enough to know this wasn't over. Upstairs, the clock marked the hour. I closed my notebook, slid it under my arm and turned off the light, already aware that the proof hadn't freed me at all. It had armed me. And once I admitted that, I stopped pretending I needed answers right away. I moved through the house differently the next morning, quieter but more alert, like I was listening for something just out of range. He came back before breakfast, acting ordinary on purpose, setting his keys down too neatly. I noticed that. He talked while he poured cereal, filling the space with explanations I hadn't asked for. I let him. Words are generous when you don't interrupt them. He said he'd always felt something was off. He said friends had planted doubts. He said he'd stayed for my mother anyway, as if endurance were the same as kindness. I sat at the table, hands folded, watching milk creep up the bowl's edge. I asked neutral questions. Who noticed first? Why no? Each answer created another thread and I followed them silently, knot by knot. Later, I drove my mother to her appointment. The car smelled like peppermint and leather cleaner. She talked about her knees, the weather, the neighbor's new dog. I nodded and stored the sound of her voice the way you save something fragile. In the waiting room, while she filled forms, I read through my notes again. A few questions finally resolved themselves. Others sharpened. The nurse's name hovered there, unresolved, like a door you know leads somewhere important. When we got home, he was on the phone. I caught fragments as I passed the study. I knew it, he said. I always knew. I paused just long enough to register who he was talking to, then kept walking. Information travels fast when it feels vindicating. I wrote the time down. It mattered more than I'd expected. That afternoon I visited Mrs. Hanley. She'd lived across the street since before I was born. Her house smelled like old books and lemon oil. We sat at her small table, hands wrapped around mugs, and I asked about the winter I was born. She remembered the storm, the power outage, the hospital running on generators. She didn't remember my father being there. Strange, she said. He was always so loud. I thanked her and left with my ears ringing. At home he wanted to talk. He wanted agreement. He wanted absolution. I told him I was tired. That wasn't a lie. He mistook it for retreat and talked more freely, pacing, revising history out loud. I learned which memories he'd rehearsed and which ones surprised even him. When he noticed my notebook on the counter, he asked about it. I said I'd taken up journaling. He laughed, relieved. That night I spread everything out again. New names. New dates. Small confirmations clicking into place. Not answers yet. But structure. I felt the strain in my shoulders ease just enough to sleep. Dreams came in pieces. Hospital hallways. A woman's voice calling a name I couldn't hear. The next day I went back to the records office. Different clerk this time. Younger. Efficient. She explained which files were missing and which could be requested with additional authorization. I filled out forms carefully, my handwriting steady. When she slid the receipt across the counter, our fingers brushed. She smiled politely. Good luck, she said without knowing why. When I returned, he was waiting. He asked where I'd been. I told him errands. He asked if I believed him. I said belief wasn't the issue anymore. That unsettled him. He asked what was. I said I was listening. He frowned, unsure how to argue with that. In the evening my daughter called. I kept my voice light, asked about her kids, the garden she'd started. She asked if things were resolved. I said not yet. She exhaled and I heard the relief in it. Patience too can be inherited. After dinner he started again, softer now, almost pleading. I let him talk. I watched his story settle into something he could live with. When he finished, he looked at me like he'd handed me the last piece. I closed my notebook, finally meeting his eyes, knowing I had collected far more than he realized. Silence stretched between us, thick but steady. He shifted first, clearing his throat, waiting for me to speak. I didn't. I gathered the papers instead, stacking them neatly, feeling the quiet authority of weight and order. The dining room light hummed overhead. Dust floated through it, visible for once. I carried everything to the table and laid it out without ceremony, letting the shapes and edges speak before I ever did. He leaned forward despite himself. The sound of paper sliding made him flinch. I noticed that too. I placed the records in a simple line, dates aligned, margins squared. Then the photocopy. Then the form with the missing signature. His questions came out uneven. Where did you get that? Why are you doing this? I answered only what was necessary. From offices. From files. Because it matters. My mother stood in the doorway, drawn by the change in air. I hadn't called her down, but she came anyway. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, eyes clear. When he looked at her, she didn't look away. That was new. I felt something settle into place behind my ribs, a long ache easing without fanfare. He tried to explain again, softer now, rearranging his story to fit the documents. I didn't argue. I slid one page closer to him, tapping the corner with my finger. The nurse's name was there, spelled 2 different ways on 2 different forms. He stared at it too long. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like a picture frame loosening on the wall. A knock came at the door. The timing startled us all. It was my daughter, unplanned, breathless from the cold. She took in the scene with one glance and said nothing, just pulled out a chair and sat beside her grandmother. The 3 of us formed a line he couldn't cross. He noticed. His voice thinned. I asked him to read the dates out loud. He stumbled once, then corrected himself. I asked him where he was that week. He said he couldn't remember. I believed him. Memory has a way of protecting us from what we avoided. I pointed out the gap, the missing hours, the absence that paperwork remembers even when people don't. He pushed back from the table, palms flat, breathing shallow. So what are you saying? He asked. I thought carefully before answering. I'm saying the truth is already here, I said. It doesn't need me to dress it up. The words felt right. Calm. Accurate. The house creaked as the heat kicked on. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on damp pavement. Ordinary life kept moving, indifferent to our reckoning. I gathered the papers again, slower this time, and placed them into a folder. I wrote a name on the tab. His eyes followed the pen. He swallowed. He asked what would happen next. I told him I didn't know yet. That wasn't humility. It was honesty. Control doesn't require certainty, only readiness. I stood, feeling the strength in my legs, surprising and welcome. My mother reached for my hand. My daughter squeezed my shoulder. I noticed then how tired he looked, how much effort it took him to hold his position. Not regret exactly, but strain. I felt no urge to comfort him. That absence told me everything about how far I'd come. The truth had shifted the balance quietly, permanently, and I let it. The air in the room felt clearer, thinner somehow, as if a window had been opened without anyone touching it. I realized I was no longer afraid of what he might say next or who he might tell. That fear had dissolved, replaced by something solid and calm within me. That calm felt earned, settled, and it stayed when nothing else mattered. He remained seated, smaller somehow, staring at the place where the papers had been. I stayed by the table a moment longer, smoothing the folder edges, listening to my own breathing return to normal. My daughter whispered if I was all right. I told her yes, and meant that I was steadier than I'd been in years. My mother stood carefully and touched the back of his chair, not unkindly, not forgiving, just present. He didn't look up. I carried the folder to the hall cabinet and slid it onto the shelf between insurance policies and old tax returns. It belonged there, part of the record of a life. When I closed the cabinet, the click sounded final in a way words never had. I went back to the dining room and turned off the light, leaving him in the quiet he'd created, knowing the truth no longer needed my voice. I turned off the dining room light and stood there, hands still on the switch, feeling how quiet can finally belong to you. He didn't follow me. That was the first sign the balance had shifted. I walked to the porch and pulled on my coat, the fabric familiar, dependable. Outside, evening settled in with the smell of cold leaves and wood smoke. I sat on the steps and let the chill reach my bones. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was waiting for myself. He came out eventually, slower than usual, carrying the look of someone who expects to be stopped. I didn't move. He said my name like a question. I answered it with silence. He told me he could explain the nurse, that he'd found her name years ago and ignored it because it complicated things. That was the twist finally spoken. He had known there was another truth and chose the easier lie. Hearing it out loud didn't sting. It clarified. I asked him why he let my mother carry the blame. He said he was afraid of being wrong. I nodded because fear explains a lot without excusing anything. I told him the truth had come out without my voice because it never needed permission. It only needed time and records and patience. He looked at the dark yard, not at me. The next morning I drove my mother to the courthouse. The building smelled like cleaner and old paper. We met with a clerk who amended a record that had been wrong longer than it should have been. My mother's shoulders lifted as the pen scratched across the form. It was a small correction with a large weight. She squeezed my hand and smiled the way she used to when things were finally done. I mailed copies to the places that mattered. The hospital. The records office. A letter to him, brief and factual, stating what was now official. No accusations. No anger. Just closure in black ink. When I dropped it in the mailbox, the metal clanged shut with a certainty I trusted. He called once. I let it ring. He texted asking if there was any chance we could talk. I wrote back that there was nothing left to resolve. That answer felt complete. I blocked the number without ceremony. It wasn't cruelty. It was maintenance. Life didn't transform overnight. It widened. I noticed how mornings felt lighter. I noticed my mother humming while she cooked. My daughter visited and laughed more easily, like a tension she'd carried without naming had finally eased. We planted bulbs in the yard. We made soup. We talked about ordinary plans. Those were the real victories. Weeks later I saw him at the grocery store. He looked smaller, unsure where to stand. Our eyes met briefly. I nodded once, polite, distant. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I turned my card and kept going. That was the moment I understood the revenge had already happened. Not public. Not loud. Permanent. I took a different route home, passing streets I hadn't driven in years. places where I'd once swallowed words to keep peace. I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench, listening to children argue over a game, parents calling them back with tired affection. I felt older there and stronger, the way age earns its place when it stops apologizing. I realized how much energy I'd spent managing someone else's certainty, and how little it took to step out of it. I didn't win him back. I won something better. I won my time. I won my mother's peace. I won the end of flinching when footsteps sounded behind me. I won the ability to tell my story without checking his face first. On a clear afternoon, I took the folder from the cabinet and placed it in a box marked finished. I taped it shut and slid it onto a shelf in the garage. Sunlight cut through the dust, catching on the tape. I stood there a long moment, breathing in oil and cardboard, feeling grounded. That evening, I sat on the porch again, watching the sky turn. I thought about how strength doesn't arrive as a roar. It arrives as a decision you keep honoring. I thought about how truth doesn't need a voice when a life finally aligns around it. The house behind me was quiet, steady, mine. I listened to the evening sounds settle, the distant traffic, a dog barking, the low click of cooling metal. My body felt tired in an honest way. And for the first time in decades, I felt free, not because I was chosen, but because I chose myself fully and without apology at last. That truth remained. If this story touched something deep in you, you're not alone. Subscribe for more powerful real-life stories about truth, resilience, and the quiet revenge of living fully.